Just to let you guys know, I am rebranding this channel. It was Modern Buddhist Practice. Now I'm going to be branching out and doing some things that are a little bit more general. Going to be talking about meditation, philosophy, Buddhism in much more general terms. And as part of that, I think I'm just going to test the waters and see if it's of benefit to anyone to do sessions like this live where you can come on and just ask whatever questions you like. For those who don't know me, which is probably most of you randomly coming across my my channel, I'm a PhD with concentration on or a master's that concentrated on cognitive science and meditation, and a PhD that focused on Buddhist philosophy. And I've also been training with pretty serious Buddhist teachers as well for about 20 years. So if you have any questions related to Buddhism, philosophy, meditation, that's really what this series will be about. So I suppose I'll just start with a short discussion of some topics that I've been studying recently in the Lamrim, if there are no open questions. One of the topics we went over in retreat was rumination meditation, and this is a type of meditation that's not often discussed at any great length when you're encountering meditation in a Western setting, but is nonetheless extremely, extremely important in terms of actual practice. And basically, what it entails is thinking through something until your attitude or motivation or intention changes, and then using the skills that you've gained in meditation from other types of practice having to do with concentration, then holding that result in your mind until your mind begins to change. So, this is one of the foundational skills for training in meditation more generally. Most of the topics in Buddhism, I would say, fall into this category. And if you'd like a bit more of a reference for that, you can look at something like this whole subject of mindfulness, for example, is quite has received a lot of attention in scholarly literature recently because basically the way that mindfulness has been defined in the Western canon is radically inaccurate. Mindfulness doesn't mean sitting around with your mind having no judgments, no concepts, no ideas of what's going on, that's not what mindfulness is. Mindfulness actually refers to memory, and in the Buddhist ecological canon, it's talking about both short-term memory and long-term memory. And part of your active memory, in terms of training your mind, is being able to either call up an intention, a motivation, an attitude at will, right? You encounter something like this cup, and you remember, the cup, although it appears to be unchanging from moment to moment, actually it's made up of incredibly fast-moving particles, and those particles are changing every moment. And maybe you use modern physics to do this kind of analysis, or maybe you use the works of Dharmakirti. Uh, if you were trained in classical Gelug Indian kind of thought from Nalanda, you would be using the logic of logic based around the fact that if this object was unchanging by nature, or if it even had a single moment of not changing, then it should, in point of fact, go out of existence in the way that it appears to us now. Why is that? Well, uh, if the object weren't changing, for example, light wouldn't reflect off of it, and then you wouldn't be able to see it. So this is one small indication that, yes, this object must be a changing thing, even though it appears to my cognitive faculties, we could say, even though it appears to my mind as something unchanging. And so you do analysis like this of common everyday objects and of yourself until the attitude changes. When you see the cup, the cup is impermanent, right? It's convenient that it has a skull on it. That helps. And so when this change in understanding, this change in attitude comes up in your mind through thinking the issue through, then you use concentration gained from other types of practice to hold that change in attitude, to hold that change in understanding until that becomes the natural way that you see cups when you're looking at cups. And then you generalize that, tables, people, events, and so forth. And this is how you train your mind, right? And what does this have to do with mindfulness? What this has to do with mindfulness is this: mindfulness, again, is not bare attention or naked attention or non-judgmental attention. Mindfulness means that you can recall the way this object actually exists, really, in point of fact, when it counts, right? So when the cup suddenly shatters on the ground, maybe it's your grandfather's prize mug from whatever, that your mind is already prepared for the fact that the cup is impermanent. Your mind is already prepared for the fact that the cup will at some point go out of existence. Your mind is already prepared for the fact that your beloved, my dog is sleeping over here, your beloved dog or cat or parents or friends or whatever will eventually go out of existence. And in the same way, well, actually, there's no reason to go there. So what mindfulness means is that you have the ability, using your memory, your faculty of recalling things from the past, to, when you encounter a new, fresh experience, to go, I remember all of this information about all of these arguments, all of these reasons why this object is impermanent, and you understand it and relate to it emotionally as impermanent in this moment. And that's an active process involved with your memory. That's what mindfulness means. So when you look at, for example, the sutta on mindfulness in the Pali Canon, what you find is that there's this huge description there about what to do when you see dead bodies, right? And the instructions in that sutta are not that you stand back with non-judgmental awareness when you see those dead bodies. It is to recall analysis that you've done in the past where you have thought through over and over and over again. At some point, I'll be a skeleton. This body will be a skeleton. At some point, this body will be swollen and festering and decaying. At some point, there's all these different ways that you contemplate what the body's going to look like when it starts to decay and fall apart. At first it just loses its color and its warmth, and then it swells up and becomes festering, and then there's insects, and then there's explosions of guts and all of this stuff, and then at some point there's bones with a little bit of flesh, and then there's bones with just sinew, and then there's bones that are yellow, and then there's bones that are white, right? So if you were just left out in the wilderness somewhere, your body would go through a series of stages, and yes, there's some give or take on what those stages are, but broadly speaking, the mindfulness of death described in the Pali Canon is not just to sit in a non-judgmental state of awareness about death. It is to become fully convinced and aware from moment to moment, I will die. This body will decay. That same fact applies to your beloved pets, your beloved friends. It applies to all sorts of things in another sort of way. It applies to your wealth. It applies to your good looks. It applies to the building that you happen to be sitting in. This is a fairly nice room I am sitting in today, but in a few hundred years, who knows, right? And things fall apart by nature. We know this in the West. We call it entropy. Chaos tends to increase by nature, not as the result of something else acting on something else. Rather, things themselves are in a constant state of flux, and therefore, over time, they become something else and they fall apart. So we've got a few people. Okay. So Cleric is here. Hey, Cleric, welcome back. So mindfulness of death, mindfulness of death is really, really fascinating subject. It is maybe the most useful and widely used philosophical tool you find on the planet. I mean, you find it in Christianity. If you listen to imams talking in Islam, they're almost, I mean, at least the sermons and things I've seen, constantly talking about the fact that you're going to die and you have to leave all this behind. I mean, it's just an incredibly useful tool for cutting to the point, right? What are you doing here? If you can't take any of this with you, what are you actually doing here? What's important? What's not important? Death is going to really tell you what's important, what's not important, right? And you commonly see this even if you're just browsing around social media, you'll see, oh, when you're on your deathbed, think back to blah, 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 right? That's not actually a very effective way to get at the feeling that you are temporary. Uh, a fantastic way to get at the feeling that you're temporary is to think about the fact that, like, just beneath the skin here, there's bones. I mean, you're literally a skeleton walking around, you know? And then attached to that skeleton, right? There are sinews. There are sinews. And attached to those sinews, there are muscles. And then overlaying all of that, there's connective tissue and veins and all of this, right? So when you break your body down like this, you start to go, oh, wow. Yeah, I'm actually made up of a lot of unstable stuff. And so this has the effect of, yes, of course, if you start thinking about the fact that the body's going to get old, the body's going to fall apart, the body's going to die, the body's going to decay, you're and remember this term attachment. If you've been around a while, you may know this term attachment, raga, means that you exaggerate the benefits or positive qualities of something. It doesn't mean that you can't have friends, right? Or loved ones, or that you can't be close to your kids. You need to be close to people. This is the meaning of loving kindness, the meaning of universal love and universal compassion. Yeah. So in the chat, Cleric said, I've been wondering about that. A lot of people wonder about that, where you go, well, wait a minute. If I'm supposed to give up attachment, does that mean I need to forget about my parents? Does that mean I need to forget about my kids? Does that mean I need to forget about my pets? Does this mean I need to push everyone away and become some weirdo that lives in you know, I don't know. You fill in the blank. So no, it doesn't mean that. It doesn't mean that. So attachment is a translation of a term, raga, that I've put this up before. I don't know. That's probably way too much information for like a random Wednesday, but this term doesn't actually mean like being close to people or even having stuff. Like this coat is relatively nice. I mean, I've had it for 10 years, but it's a decent coat. This is a nice room. This is my wife collects antiques, so there's old stuff behind me that's fairly nice. There's a fairly nice bookcase here with lots of old books that are all quite nice, right? So nice stuff and getting rid of nice stuff is not the meaning of attachment or non-attachment. Right? What attachment means is that your mind exaggerates the benefits of some particular thing. And then because your mind has exaggerated that, then that thing becomes exaggerated in your perception. And we've all had this experience, right? So for example, uh, think about the last time you were really attracted to somebody. I mean, really attracted. And the first few weeks, few months, maybe the first couple of years, you see them and it's like, wow, like they're almost sparkling when you look at them, and you're overwhelmed. This, even if they smell bad, you're like, oh wow, their smell, whatever, right? The sound of their voice, their touch is like magical to you. This is what attachment does to your perception. So it exaggerates the positive qualities of something, and then those actually appear in your sensory perceptions, which is pretty wild. We also know this from cognitive psychology. What we would call attachment in Buddhist psychology, what though they sometimes study as quote unquote love in cognitive psychology, and they say that the brain activity of someone who's in love, like head over heels, is indistinguishable from a person who's doing cocaine. You're addicted, and you are like seriously addicted to that person. So it is this radical exaggeration of our perception that is raga, or attachment. And that's what you're trying to overcome. You see? And then on the other side, there's this other mental factor called pratika, which is sometimes called, it's translated anger or hatred. Uh, well, anyways, just to back up real quick and tie it all back up. So we started talking about mindfulness for those who are joined a little bit later here. Mindfulness means memory. It doesn't mean having naked, non-judgmental awareness. It means to recall something. And you need this strong force of memory, especially active memory, to not forget what you're doing in order to train your mind from moment to moment, which is a big part of what Buddhism is about. And then we were talking about mindfulness of death, which means to remember that you're going to die. And one powerful tool in remembering that you're going to die is reinforcing again and again that the body itself is made of all of these parts that you will, just like other bodies, you will see decay and break down in certain ways. And that has all sorts of benefits, including, someone said in the chat, does that reduce attachment? Somebody's dropping in saying they enjoyed the response to Christianity. Yeah, if you have questions about that, please do chip in. I'll try to, I want to stay sort of on track, but I'm gonna please do put your questions in the chat because I'll get to them. So then, okay, so we're reducing attachment. This kind of attachment is not that you feel close to people, because the Buddha felt extraordinarily close to people. In addition to that, when you look at modern masters like Mingyur Rinpoche, for example, has had brain scans done, and they asked him to generate universal compassion, and his brain scan showed so much activity in the empathy part of his brain that it didn't fit on the normal bell curve for human empathy. It was so far over here on the far end of the bell curve, like if this is our bell curve, it was so far over here, it was like a different category of so-called empathy, or feeling, feeling the desire for others to be happy and free from suffering. It was like completely off the charts. So of course, you must feel close to people, and that's an important part of loving kindness and compassion. So now the question is meditation, right? So someone asked, is meditation an attempt to slow down your imagination? Well, it's a really interesting question, right? A really interesting question. If you look at Taoist meditation methods from some schools, if you look at Hindu meditations from some schools, if you look at Buddhist meditations from some schools, they use imagination all over the place. All over the place. Your imagination's incredibly important and powerful. I'll give you an example right now. For anyone who's watching, just sort of make yourself a little more comfortable, and just imagine the taste of your favorite food. Just for a moment, close your eyes, hear my voice, Just imagine you're taking a bite of your favorite food and you're starting to chew it, right? How many people had their mouth start to water? They've done all these tests in cognitive psychology that say, for example, if you're recovering from an injury, if you imagine that you're using that limb to do stuff, or if you imagine that you're lifting weights, that your muscles respond not quite as much as if you were actually lifting weights, but your nervous system and your muscles, even your muscles, change based upon what you're imagining. So our ability to imagine and then reshape our perception, reshape our bodies even, is really remarkable. And this has been picked up on by the Taoists, the Buddhists, the Hindus, probably also the Jains, but I haven't studied the Jains very much. And so, no, it's not just slowing down your imagination. And some types of meditation, you really don't slow your mind down at all in a traditional sense, which is quite confusing for beginners. But I don't want to jump into too many things. So I would say this. I would say that the main, especially if you're not going to spend years in retreat, and you know, I mean, I've said this before, but I've done some quite lengthy retreats myself, and okay. So let me back up just real quick. So meditation is about learning to, I would say, in principle, learning to direct your intention that your mind has decided to engage in a particular course of action, and then it doesn't forget what it intended to do and do something else instead. And refining that to an incredible level. And then when that's quite refined, then making the mind fresher and brighter and more lucid so that whatever it's doing intentionally and deliberately, that it has a great deal of psychological power and force. And the great meditators of the world have learned, and we have some actual cognitive scientific data on these types of practices now. But the great meditators of the world have learned, as we've learned with studies in things like flow, for example, that if you can generate a really powerful state of concentration that's really bright and lucid and awake and fresh and not like, right? Then your body and mind stay fresh for a really long time. And so this is called pliancy in the meditative literature of Buddhism, of sort of middle and late Indian Buddhism and Tibetan Buddhism. And pliancy can become so well developed that you can sit for weeks. There are people in my community, extended Buddhist community that I know through my teachers and so forth, that can actually do those things. Like there are still modern people doing this. Okay. So not necessarily slowing down your imagination, but learning how to shape what your mind does so that it functions better, works better. Okay. Let's see. So somebody says, "What is the title of the video that responds to Christianity?" So there have been a couple videos on this channel that I responded to some Christian stuff. And for clarity, I'm not attacking Christianity or Judaism or Islam, but instead, when I find a video by a really well-educated minister or a really well-educated imam or Muslim leader or a really well-educated Western philosopher, and they get some stuff wrong about Buddhism that other people who aren't educated about Buddhism at all or who are new to Buddhism in the modern world also get wrong, I think that's a tremendous opportunity to correct some errors and do something interesting and worthwhile for people to watch and consume. Also, there are some really, really challenging things in Buddhist thought that, frankly, I think need modern answers, modern responses. And because Buddhism, despite having 100 million members, is not particularly popular in Western academic discussions, or frankly, even in polemical circles among Christian ministers and so forth, um, those problems and questions just aren't really, they're not attacked very much, which in one sense is good for the Buddhists. But on the other hand, I think what happens is you stumble on these problems because you get a little bite here, a little nibble there. You stumble on these difficulties, and then no one in your community has responded to these difficulties. And then over a number of years, those eat at you, and then at some point you give up. you know, why wouldn't you? So that, in brief, is why I respond, because sometimes they do poke these difficult, seemingly difficult problems, like if nirvana means to overcome desire, and you need desire to attain nirvana, then haven't you defeated your own system? Isn't that a big problem? Well, no, it's not a big problem at all. It's actually quite an easy problem to solve if you understand what we mean by desire, because those terms don't correspond to the terms that have been translated, right? Tanha with desire is not the same thing as chanda, desire. One is a delusional desire, the desire for something that doesn't exist or can't happen. And the other is a desire for something that does exist and can happen. Those are two different things. So, of course, if you're chasing a fantasy, you're going to be disappointed and you're going to suffer. If you're chasing something real with methods that can get you there, then you'll continue taking steps until you get there. So, those are completely different things. The Buddha said your hair needs to be on fire to attain nirvana. You need to be striving like a person with your hair or your clothing on fire if you want to attain nirvana. That's how strong your desire needs to be. But it's chanda. It's desire for something that is real, that can be attained with methods that are appropriate for attaining it. So there's no contradiction at all between that desire and the attainment of nirvana. Someone want to challenge me? Okay, let's see what else is in the chat here. I can't remember because it was several months ago now, but there's 2 or 3 videos from Christian apologists that I've responded to. Okay, someone else, Andreas asks, I'd like to know your thoughts about Goenka, Mahasawada methods, and is it true that they are not what the Buddha taught? Okay, so that is an interesting question and debate to have. How much do I want to respond to that? So, I mean, it's a good question. I would say this. Quite often, someone says, like, I couldn't even pretend to know enough to challenge you on the question I just raised. No, honestly, like, even if you have sort of what you think is a stupid challenge, somebody else is probably thinking what you're thinking. So if something I said where you're going, yeah, but how does this work? Or, then throw it out there because somebody else might be thinking the same thing. Okay, so Goenka and Mahasawada. I can never pronounce that gentleman's name correctly, so I apologize. So Goenka, here's the thing. Quite often when I'm standing outside a system of practice of any kind, that's a serious type of practice, okay? Quite often I think it seems like this part is missing, or, oh, isn't that part over there missing? And then years later, decade later, I'll talk to somebody who's like spent 5 or 10 years training in that system, and they go, "Oh, no, that's there, but it's not there until later," or "It's there, but we don't really talk about it in the way that you're talking about it. We talk about it in this other way, and we're still getting to that point, but we don't use the same language," or whatever. And so I'm not always comfortable commenting on whether or not a system is complete, let's say, as like a complete system of training. So here's what I would say. if you look at what the Pali Canon teaches, and that's where the Goenkas and the Mahasawada, again, apologies for the pronunciation, those methods fit in. The main method is basically or one of the main methods is basically doing body scanning meditation. You become aware of what your body actually is, what it's composed of, and you become aware of the actual tactile sensations. If anyone's interested in that, the retreat that I just completed with some people, there's like 2 days where almost all we did is body scanning. So you can go and watch those videos and look at the way that I do it if you'd like. But those practices are incredibly effective, incredibly powerful for helping you generate concentration on the one hand. And for those who are interested in things like selflessness, emptiness, the sort of wisdom aspect of Buddhism, which is, I've always been kind of an emptiness guy. A lot of people are they're on the compassion side. They want the love and the empathy and the patience and all of this, and the wisdom side, they're kind of like, meh. So usually you kind of, for some reason, you're on one side or the other. I was always an emptiness guy. Okay, yeah. So this is perfectly timed. So someone in the in the chat here, Cleric said, what in the world does it mean that there's no self? So that's an excellent question. So let's combine these two questions, which is the Goenka Mahasawada Vipassana question and the no self question. Okay, so consider this. First, again, all of these body scanning practices where you're learning to gain direct access to what your senses are doing, and in particular what your tactile sense is doing, and then pulling back and becoming aware of the contents of your mind. So again, for those who did retreat, potentially at some point in retreat, right? If this is normally, it feels like this. Like if you look at your mind right now, you're having a thought and you're having a feeling. You're having many thoughts, many feelings, and it seems like you and your mind and the thoughts and feelings are like this, right? It seems like you are the thought. That's my thought. That's who I am. That's my feeling. That's who I am, right? But as soon as you start gaining some concentration, then you start to be able to go like this, and the mind that is being aware of the thought or emotion, and the thought and emotion and so forth, is now appearing in the mirror of the mind like this, so that the mind is aware of these things that are happening, but the mind doesn't self-identify with those things. Okay? So when you're doing Goenka, Sawada, body scanning to mind scanning, whatever term you want to use, kinds of meditative approaches, this is all standard Buddhist kind of stuff. So I think up to that point, we would have to say, yeah, that's all Buddhist. And before that, what kind of ethics are they putting into place? Well, it's Buddhist ethics. So we've got Buddhist ethics, we've got Buddhist meditation, and then are they getting to selflessness or no self or not? Is the next question. And I think in the case of Sawada, I think 100%. In the case of Goenka's practices, I haven't seen them talk about selflessness, but all of those body scanning, mind scanning practices have to do with gaining experiential ability to see that all of the components that make you up are not the self that seems to be there when you're kind of not paying attention. And that's a big subject. So there's a really simple and fun thought experiment that Dr. Jay Garfield put forward, and he said, imagine this, okay? If you want to understand the type of self that Buddhism is saying is not there, right? Because self could be defined in so many different ways. If you want to understand the one that Buddhism says is not there, think about this example. Imagine that you yourself were in imagine someone you know, okay? So pick a friend. Does everyone have a friend? Hopefully, you all have at least one friend in real life. So pick someone you know and just imagine that your mind was in their body. Can everybody do that? Okay. So you imagine that your mind is in their body. Okay. Now, imagine that you had their mind instead of your mind. Does it still feel like it's you somehow? Even though you have their mind and their body, and there's none of you left. But somehow me is there, right? You go, no, 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 no. Me is there, even though I have their mind and their body. So that sense of me that is somehow not tied up with the mind, that sense of me that is somehow also not tied up with the body, that sense that there is like this unchanging, independent, unitary or singular thing that is the real me, that I could, if I so desired, plop into my friend's body and then I would have their body and mind, right? Like a little pearl, right? That little self, that self doesn't exist. And so when you look at Goenka practices, what's called drive vipassana, where you don't yet have samadhi, you don't yet have full concentration, but you're doing meditative analysis nonetheless to develop concentration, which is actually a new practice, relatively new practice. It's only been around 100 years or so. Works very well. But so when you do those practices, you gain the experiential ability to access and see, here's the body, right? You went through all the components. You gain the ability to access and see, here's my five senses. You gain the ability to access and see, here are my thoughts. You gain the ability to access and see, here's my mind, being aware of all the thoughts and contents of mind. Right? And having seen all of the components that make you up from direct experience, you know for sure from direct experience that little pearl of self that you thought was there isn't anywhere in the system. There's no part of the system that is that little pearl that you could pull out and simply transplant somewhere else. And this is why really the teachings on Buddhist wisdom aren't about faith and really aren't even about Buddhism. In fact, I've heard quite well-known teachers say, like if you were Eastern Orthodox, for example, and you did the Eastern Orthodox prayer and gained samadhi through doing repetitive prayer, and then through some kind of special observation of yourself in concentration, you notice that what you thought was your soul, some sort of singular entity that made you what you are, you notice that wasn't there. That's Buddhist insight, right? Doesn't matter. Doesn't matter all the rest of the trappings that you came to the insight with. I might have some questions about that interpretation, but it's still interesting to consider that really the the point is that when you look for this independent, unchanging, solitary thing that is completely different from body and mind, you can't find something like that. Okay, so now there's a whole bunch of questions and comments in the chat, so let me get through some of these. Uh, Wordscape says, we have Goenka in my country too. I try to discourage people from attending these kinds of meditation camps. The best option is to approach monastics, which supplement samadhi with dharma chats. Right. Okay, so from my understanding of the Goenka method, what makes them a challenge, let's say from the outside, to be polite, is that they want you to be 1,000% focused on Goenka. You're a Goenka person. Okay, put on your blinders. Everything else doesn't matter. You do Goenka, right? And so this comes off to some people as a little bit, so there's maybe a little problem there, right? Okay, fine. Okay, fine. I agree. That's probably not the best approach. On the other hand, especially in modern times, everybody wants to take everything and throw it into one big pot and go, "Oh, look, it's all the same. It's all one thing. I'm going to do on Tuesdays. I'm going to do like a drumming circle, and on Wednesdays I'm going to do this, and then on Fridays I'm going to do these 14 things, and we'll see where it ends up." Right? And where it ends up is like 20 years later, you're not very good at drumming or any of the other 17 things you tried. That's where it ends up. So there is something to be said about putting on the blinders and really doing one thing hardcore. Goenka also did, as far as I understand, include as part of his syllabus Dharma chats, but focused mostly on less talking, more doing the practices. And then it's more like a Zen style in some ways, where you do the practices and then they're pointing out to you the facts that you notice because you have done the practices, which is very skillful, I think. So again, I don't actually have a strong opinion about Goenka, uh, but I do think their practices for mindfulness, mindfulness and so forth are quite good. Uh, yeah. So we talked about a bit about no self. Someone said, when I meditate enough, feelings feel like they happen to me rather than they are me. Yeah. I mean, this is a very good insight. Yeah. So as you trade in meditation, you gain more experience in meditation. What I it's a bit like, I hate to use the cliche example, but it's a bit like an onion, okay? And you think when you get to the center of the onion, there's going to be a pearl of self. And you peel away the first layer, which let's say it's tactile sensations and the body. Okay, let's say that's the first layer. You peel that away and you go, oh, actually, individually, I could lose any component of the body and I wouldn't be missing. Like you could take this small part of my brain, and as long as you put it back where it was and take another little part of my brain and so forth, blah, 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 pretty much my entire nervous system could be done away with as long as you didn't do away with all of it and I died, right? And I, quote unquote, would still be here. Furthermore, you could take my left eye, you could take my right eye, you could take my nose, you could take my ears, you could take my tongue, you could take all of my tactile sensations, and I would seemingly still be here. And it's one thing to say all this, but if you do it in meditation, where you actually become aware of the entire tactile field, the entire auditory field, the entire visual field, the entire smell field, the entire taste field, and so forth, then it's a very powerful experiential reason where you go, actually, I looked for self standing between vision and what was seen. I actually looked there myself. And between the two, there was no self. There was just the seer, which was my eye, and the consciousness that was knowing what was coming in through the eye, and what was seen. That was it. There was no self in there. And then, having done that with the five external senses, then you look at consciousness, right? Which at first, as you said, it seems like this. It seems like feelings and thoughts and emotions and the mind are all kind of one garbled mess, and that's kind of me. And then you do some meditation and they kind of go like this. And then it seems like there's all of this, hey, hey, Offer John. That's okay. This was not scheduled. So you can always go back and watch the recording. It'll be in this folder. And I'm probably going to be doing these regularly since people seem to be getting something out of it. So, yeah, I mean, really, the whole theme of this, just to quickly divert, is pop in, ask questions, ask difficult questions, challenge things. Tell me what your difficulties are, and I'll do my best to answer them on the fly. Okay, so then you do some meditation, right? So we eliminated the five external senses as places where there was the type of self that we thought was there, right? We thought there was this singular me in there somewhere that was owning everything. We looked at vision and what was seen, and when we looked All we found was like a seeing consciousness and a thing that was being seen. That's all we found. There was no self in between the two, like again, like a little pearl in between. There was no, it wasn't there. And so from experience, direct experience, you go, oh, that's not there. And then you do the same with hearing, smell, taste, and touch. And now all five external senses, which make you up, you know from personal experience. It doesn't matter what they wrote. It doesn't matter what Socrates had to say about it. Doesn't matter what Averroes had to say on the subject, or Maimonides, or the church fathers. Doesn't In a way, it doesn't matter what the Buddha had to say about it, because you looked. It's like you went to the fridge and you opened the door and you looked and there was no milk. And nobody can come along later and say, no, no, there was, you know, there was really milk there, because you opened it, you looked everywhere, literally, and there was no milk. Well, maybe your wife. Your wife could. Your wife would go in there and immediately find it. So if you want to find yourself, just get married and your wife will tell you all about yourself. Okay. So then you get to consciousness, right? Okay, we'll come back to that wordscape. So then you get to consciousness, right? You do some meditation. First, it seems like thoughts and consciousness and emotions are kind of like this, they're just stuck together. And then when the mind gets a little more calm, it's almost like there's one part of the mind that's calmly observing, and then there's stuff happening on the surface of the mind, and the mind is aware of it, but it isn't the mind. So, as the cleric said, uh, oh, when I meditate enough, feelings feel like they happen to me rather than they are me, right? And so, this is you looking at the contents of the mind and realizing there's no pearl in there. That's something happening to consciousness or happening in consciousness, right? But there's no self in there because it's constantly changing, it's arising and ceasing. Sometimes there's nothing, sometimes there's stuff there. So that's not a self, that's just a bunch of stuff. So then the mind looks at itself in terms of consciousness. And what does it find? Well, again, you have to look. You have to look and see, is there a self in there? Or is it just like vision, where you looked and all that's there is what is seen and the seer. And the seer is the consciousness of vision. It's not a self, right? And in the same way, the mental consciousness is the knower, not a self, right? Mental consciousness is knowing the stuff that appears, is generated by and appears in mental consciousness. But again, you have to look in meditation, and this sort of go look and see, the invitation to look and see, is something you find all the way from the Pali Canon all the way up to super advanced tantric stuff. It's all over the place. In reality, you have to gain the skill to be able to look inside and see if there's the self that you think is there or not. Now, of course, when you do that, you don't go, oh gosh, I don't exist anymore. Well, it's been good playing with you. I'm out of here. That's not how it goes, right? You just realize that the components that make you up are all that there is. There's not an additional thing that is you. There's just all of the components that make you up. And just like we were saying earlier, it's like the cup. All of these components are things that are constantly changing, made of parts, coming from causes and conditions. And if you ask the great meditators, including modern meditators, by the way, they'll tell you that when the mind gets sufficiently calm, you recall past lives. And then another major psychological event, because you go, oh, wow, I haven't always had my mind. My mind and all the components making it up besides the most fundamental elements, has also been changing for a long time, right? So, okay, I think that's probably enough about selflessness. Um, Lots of new comments and questions here. Okay, so Wordscape asks, how do you explain to non-Buddhists that the Buddha does not tell you to cull your desires, but to desire correctly? They always say the Buddha tells you to cull desires. Okay, so this is a very, very important point. I went over it sort of when I was talking about desire on the path to enlightenment, desire on the path to nirvana and enlightenment. So in Buddhism, there are two major classes of what we would in English we would just translate as desire. One of them is attachment. This word raga, which I'll put in the chat without diacritics, is raga. Okay, so raga just it means again that there's a lot of different ways you can talk about it, but one of the most, if not the most important way to talk about it is that your perception exaggerates the positive qualities of things, and then in response to that, you generate um, clinging and grasping. That you grab onto them and you don't want to let them go. You want to have them close to you. You want to retain them. You never want to lose them because you're exaggerating the positive qualities. That you're exaggerating the benefits they can bring you, basically, right? And because you're exaggerating the benefits they can bring you, they appear exaggerated in your perception, literally and actually. When you see a piece of chocolate cake or ice cream or choose the sweet that you absolutely love, for you, it almost sparkles, right? Until you've had a couple of bites and then it looks normal and sometimes even gross. You look at it and you're like, oh gosh, that's like looking pretty bad now, right? So that's how attachment works. That's how desire, which is also how you translate raga, that's how it works. So when you're not doing that, and you're desiring something that's real and you're pursuing it with methods that actually lead to getting it, there's nothing wrong with that. And the Buddha actually describes a huge number of even conventional things like how to run a business, how to manage your household finances, um, in some cases how to run a kingdom. Yeah, and you better believe there are desires that you have in that process. All right. So how do you explain, you're not culling all desires, you're just using correct desire because you're desiring things that are real and you're cultivating and you're trying to achieve them with methods that actually produce the result. That's the difference. When you're desiring things that aren't real or are exaggerated and you're pursuing satisfaction or happiness or fulfillment of that desire with methods that can't bring it about, that is an affliction. That's a mental affliction, right? It's like a mental disease. That's why the word klesha, it means disease, right? The word affliction. That's why it's translated in these ways. Okay. Uh, Cleric, I hope I answered the part about the little part of you that's in your friend's mind doesn't exist. Why doesn't that exist? Because, again, just to back up real quick, when you look at the five senses, yeah, well, I'm lagging a little. When you look at the five senses, and then you look at consciousness directly in meditation, you don't find something in between the two layers, let's say. You have the seeing consciousness and the eyeball, of course, that's the organ for seeing, and then you have what is seen. But roughly speaking, there's not like a self somewhere in here. And you know that if you lost your vision, you would still exist, right? So you could lose all five of your external senses and still exist. The only one that you feel especially like you couldn't lose is mental consciousness, your mental awareness, where the mind itself is aware of its own mental content. That's the one you feel like you really couldn't lose. But when you look in meditation at a deep concentration, when you look at consciousness, it's just like vision or hearing or these other external five senses, in that there's just this knowing factor that generates experience and is aware of or knows that experience, and there's not a third thing in between. There's not a little pearl of you in between, which means if you had your friend's body and your friend's mind, there would be none of you left, because you are your body and mind. In a Buddhist context, your stream of consciousness is what continues on after death and what came into this life. So in effect, it fulfills the criteria of a soul. It does what a soul does, but it's different from a soul in that it's not this unitary singular thing that is the real you. And there's a lot of debate about that too. I mean, I think the original term for soul actually just means breath. It means like life, which is again a much subtler concept than just like a self. you know. Okay. Is the argument against Descartes from a Buddhist perspective that he didn't go far enough? I'm not sure that Descartes was asking the same level of question that we're asking here. And I think this is in part a translation issue. So he said, I think, therefore I am. And again, he's a Christian philosopher and a dualist. And I would argue Buddhism is actually what's called a neutral monism. And he was a substance dualist, for those who are taking notes. So a neutral monist is a little bit different than a substance dualist, because a neutral monist is saying that there is basically one substance that makes up reality, but it's neutral in the sense that it is composed of what we would more classically consider to be physical stuff and consciousness, but that you cannot, in an important sense, simply reduce material stuff to consciousness or consciousness to material stuff. They are this sort of inseparable neutral monism that always comes in a packet together. So that's quite different than Descartes, who was arguing that you have a substance dualism in which mind and matter are completely different. They're basically opposites. And then you have to ask, well, then how does the body interact with the mind? So you have the mind-body problem. And in Buddhism, since it's a neutral monism, arguably you don't have that problem, even though more or less they're saying the same thing, that consciousness is non-physical and physical things are material, right? Or that consciousness is non-material and that physical things are material. Furthermore, in Buddhist thought, there's this bridging concept of I don't like using these terms because they're so loaded now, but there's things like prana, right? And so between consciousness and a physical event, there is this other substance that is material, but not made of particles and atoms. It's subtler than coarse physical stuff, which they would describe as being composed of the elements in Indian thought. Again, probably way too much information, but broadly speaking, you could think about it like this. There's material stuff, and there's consciousness, and in between, there's a third substance that is subtler than physical stuff, but it's not consciousness, but it comes along with consciousness, and it bridges the gap between the two. Right? So then this solves the mind-body problem. And since these events always come together, consciousness and physical stuff always come together, it's a neutral monism and not a substance dualism. So in an important sense, the Buddhists are agreeing with Descartes in a lot of ways, where they're saying, yeah, mind is very, very different than physical stuff. But then Descartes is really asking, because the external world, Descartes said, because the external world could all be this fake thing that the devil created, right, to deceive me, how do I know what a real thing is? How do I know what's real? And he said, well, the one thing I can know for sure is real that the devil couldn't fake is that I'm having a thought. And since I'm having a thought in my mind, I know that the thing having the thought must be real. Roughly, this is the argument. And there are a lot of counter arguments to this, by the way. But it's not really so much an argument about what is the nature of the self as it is an argument about uh, what can we be sure is not an illusion versus what we can't be sure. What can we be sure about? How do I put this? I think you understand what I mean. Some things we can't be sure that they're not an illusion, but the fact that we exist, we can be sure is not an illusion because that's not something the devil could fake, according to Descartes, right? So, you know, how important and interesting that is up to you. Okay. Someone said, how do you prevent yourself from feeling shocked out of meditation when you feel one of your senses turning off? This often happens to me. Uh, that is a good question. Okay. So, this was happening to one of my other students recently when we were in retreat. This is a very common thing, and one of my teachers put it like this when this was happening to me. He said, "When, in particular, if you're using a lot of intent." Hold on. It seems like it seems like maybe there's not enough light in the room, and that's messing with the camera. Give me 2 seconds. Yeah, that'll work. Okay. So when you're trying to attain concentration and you're using a lot of intent, a lot of forceful intent to bring your mind, let's say, to the breath, and you're bringing your mind to the breath, bringing the mind to the breath, bringing the mind to the breath, and the posture is not quite right. Let's say, yeah. And because there's so much intent on the breath, all of a sudden the mind starts to turn off tactile sensation, for example, and then the body moves or something, and then your mind's like, "Whoa, I'm moving here." And part of the attention of the mind, the bandwidth of the mind, gets pulled out of the breath and back into the body. Or you are, again, trying to put the mind on the breath and the posture is okay, but because the mind isn't used to the isn't accustomed to the fact that that all of these sub processes of your mind, okay, like, here's where I am in space right now, right? There's a whole set of processes in your fascia and everything else where your mind is aware. Here's where I am in space. And if I move my hand like this, I'll touch my table. And if I move my hand like this, I'll touch my forehead. And if I go like this, I'm going to bend over about this far, right? So there's all of these processes about where your body is in space, what your body's doing, how it's oriented. And when you turn that off, you have the sense that you're not in any particular location and you're sort of floating in space. And so you have to gain some experience. let's say that you know this is let's say that this is sort of the doorway of your meditation. You have to gain some experience sort of coming to the door and coming back and coming to the door and coming back and then going through the door and coming back so that you get used to this change in how it is that your experience is oriented. You have to get used to basically not having a body for a period of time if you're concentrating on certain types of objects. You know, another way to think about it is like turning the volume up and down. So your concentration, maybe you have it at a 9, and one of your senses is starting to turn off in a way that you're not used to. And so you turn the volume back down to a 7. Don't come all the way out, but come out enough that that weird feeling you're getting because your body is starting to disappear, doesn't distract you, and then turn it up to an 8, right? And then just hover at 7 or 8 until 8 is comfortable, and then bring it up to a 9. See? So you sort of work with yourself where you are. Okay. Uh, Offer John says, I tried to medicate. I'm assuming you mean meditate. Tried to meditate some years ago. I added a candle focused on it. Tried to open my third eye. What I expected to see, I think I saw it, almost got me insane. Real stuff at a time. Yeah. Okay. So this is another really weird thing about the time we're living in. You can hop on the internet, and you can find people talking about these, like, one part of full system, a full system, one little part of a full system of training that's actually a pretty powerful and important part of that system of training. And they just rip it out of that system of training and they throw it on the internet as, like, open your third eye. Okay, have fun. you know, what could possibly go wrong if you rewire your entire nervous system with no guidance, no help, no system, no worldview to put it all into context and tell you what it all means? What could possibly go wrong? Like if you actually have some concentration, meditation's pretty motherfucking dangerous. Okay, it's actually not a super safe activity. If you suck at it, no problem. But if you're actually getting good at meditation, it's not a very safe thing to do without guidance, because you are screwing with the thing that makes all of this seem normal to you. It's the thing that makes this into a cup in your experience. According to cognitive psychology, there's nothing that is about this object that is a cup. So if you start screwing with the thing that makes objects into what they are in your reality, and basically tells you, oh yes, you're in a room right now, or the distance from you to the wall is about this much, and blah blah blah, all sorts of weird stuff's going to start to happen. Most of it is just in your head, but because you're controlling the thing that creates perception, that's going to be pretty dramatic. It's basically like hallucinating. And then on top of that, if you do other types of stuff that have to do with the subtle body practice, right? A lot of that stuff is like putting a huge amount of extra energy, even at a physical level, into certain parts of your nervous system or your brain or your spine or major nerve clusters in your body. Of course, like there's a chance here that you're going to screw yourself up. And your nervous system, as far as I understand, doesn't repair itself very quickly. So, yeah, there are techniques in my humble understanding of the subject, in the Hindu tantras, in the Buddhist tantras, in the Taoist practices, that have to do with working with this particular location on your body to create very, very dramatic change in your psychology in a short period of time. But if you don't do that practice in a context where there's a whole system related to how you use that point and the things that happen when you engage with that point, you know, there are a lot of stories where people have totally screwed up their psychology or screwed up their bodies by doing these practices without guidance. That's why they're secret. It's not because people are trying to gatekeep stuff so they can sell it to you for a higher price later. It's because you can really hurt yourself by doing these practices. Okay, I'm going to get off my soapbox. Uh, let's see. Cleric says, your way of putting raga, of putting attachment or desire reminds me of Soren Kierkegaard saying, "Worldliness is applying infinite value to indifferent things." Oh, that's an interesting point. One of my teachers liked Kierkegaard a lot, and in particular liked Kierkegaard's description of a religious man. He said that it had a lot in common with the Japanese concept shugyo, shugyo, to become a man who struggles, to become a person who struggles, right? A person who's engaged with a struggle with themselves to train their own mind. Uh, yeah, that's kind of an interesting quote. Wordscape says, sorry, it's 4 a.m. in Taiwan. I have to run. Okay. Well, thank you for joining me from Taiwan. Uh, and come back soon. You can watch the recording, of course. Okay, new person, Gong Hao. Gong Hao says, if awareness if awareness is just an aspect of the five aggregates, then it's impermanent and not self. But then, what is the nature of the space in which the rising and falling of all aggregates is recognized? Yeah. Um, so in Buddhist metaphysics, let's say, if we zoom out, um, one of the five aggregates is non-associated compositional factors. So that's quite a mouthful, right? Non-associated compositional factors. So what is a non-associated compositional factors? What is it not associated with? Does anybody know? I mean, Gong's How. Gong Show or Gong's How? Gong's How too, Gong Show too. So do you know what it's not associated with without going to ChatGPT? So I'll wait on the chat. Not associated with phenomena. Well, phenomena is a broad category. Phenomena is a broad category. Okay, so what it's not associated with, right? When you're talking about non-associated compositional factors, is if you look at the previous compositional factors, we basically have the body, right? Form. We have the mind, and then we have two mental factors, which are part of the mind, feeling and discrimination, right? And then we have non-associated compositional factors, which is the rest of the mental factors, and space, and a number of other things. So within the fifth aggregate is the space in which everything is occurring. Space is a really fascinating subject in Buddhism, really, really important, but bears very little relationship to our understanding of space in terms of Western cosmology. When they're talking about space, they're talking about one of two kinds of things. And I'm not going to spend too much time on this because it's a bit nerdy. One is composed space, which we might correlate to sort of like space time. Composed space is there's a distance between this object and this object. And because both of these are impermanent, constantly changing objects, the space between them, by necessity, is also, since it is composed by being between these two things, it is also a constantly changing thing. And so, again, lots of differences we could point to, but that space is an impermanent, constantly changing, non static thing. Okay. There's another kind of space called non composed space. And non composed space is, gosh, how do I talk about that? Non composed space is the technically the definition is a mere lack of obstructive contact. So a mere lack of obstructive contact, just the simple fact that this object can be in this place because there's not something else stopping it from being in that space. There is a simple lack of stuff that fills the space. And so this is technically in Buddhist logic and epistemology what they would call a negative phenomenon, not negative as in bad or evil, but negative in the sense that this is a positive phenomenon that exists in the world, right? Or it is a manifest thing. And the absence of a manifest thing, in this case, the absence of obstructive contact, is what non-composed space is. So where are all of these events occurring from Buddhist perspective? Where did the universe explode into? It exploded into non-composed space. It's not a space that's made up of stuff. It's the stage upon which space-time and matter explode into, right? And it doesn't require something else to come into existence because it is the absence of stuff being in existence in that place, right? Okay, way too nerdy. Gonna dial it down. Let's see. Someone said, "Thank you for the great answer. See you next time." Someone is happy that I swear. Uh, okay. Okay, so Gong Show asks, can disciplined practice. Oh man, by the way, most of my teachers swear and swear often, which is really interesting. Not my monastic teachers who probably have vows not to swear, but my other my other teachers who are all of their own rights, pretty exceptional practitioners, recognized in their own traditions and so forth. They swear like sailors. Okay. Can disciplined practice unconsciously strengthen the separate self it originally intended on dissolving? Yes. Yes. So there is. Oh, let me see if I can pull this up. You'll have to let me know if the screen goes blank. Let's see. Let's see. Well, you can look it up on your own. I don't know that I want to pull it up on the screen, but if you just look up, there was a big kerfuffle 5 years ago, and it hit the academic scene in a way like you wouldn't believe. There was a huge kerfuffle because they found out that modern mindfulness, which they thought was this practice that would just by nature make you less egoic, more selfless, more loving, they started finding in the cognitive literature, sort of buried in the literature, and then they actually did some studies on it, that doing mindfulness practice as an independent practice without all the other spiritual trappings of being a part of a religious system actually makes you more arrogant, which is a really fascinating, or at least that people were becoming more arrogant while training in meditation. Uh, you know? So Buddhism is broken down into three main components: ethics, like the stuff that you should do, and the stuff you shouldn't do at the most obvious level of your experience. Then there's training in meditation, which mostly has to do with, at least for purposes of this discussion, mostly has to do with training in concentration. Okay. And then being able to do really profound forms of analysis using concentration. And then there's wisdom. And the wisdom aspect is, now that you have the ability to concentrate your mind, now that you have the ability to do really profound types of analysis with a concentrated mind, what do you apply that to? What do you use it to do? It's like you've made this incredibly sharp knife of concentration. You've like really honed the edge with gaining all these analytical skills. Now what do you cut with it? Yeah. So wisdom in Buddhism is the cutting part. What do we need to cut? Well, from a Buddhist perspective, you make all of these cognitive errors. You, and again, you don't even have to rely on Buddhism for this anymore. There is in Western cognitive psychological literature all of this discussion of massive error theory. And a massive error theory means that basically there are baked into your perceptual processes and cognitive processes are all of these mistakes to the effect that you don't see how things really are. I mean, this should sound pretty familiar. This is like the basis of Hindu and Buddhist philosophy 101. But Buddhism, in particular, said, look, if you train in concentration, then you know where your mind is going, you know what it's doing, you can gain access to all of the components making up the parts of your mind that you need to access to do the analysis. You can develop the skills, you can sharpen the knife so that it's really sharp and it can cut into the layers of what's going on and understand all the layers of your being. And then the wisdom aspect is here's the fact of the matter according to the great meditators. Once you've done all this work, once you've cut, here's what you find, right? That's the wisdom. And so what is the wisdom? In this case, it's the wisdom of selflessness and the wisdom of emptiness. What kind of self is not there? It's the one that we described an hour ago. And what is it empty of? It's not that there's nothing there. It's that the cognitive mistakes you're making when you look closely, that's not how it exists. You thought this was a permanent thing. That's how it sort of appeared to your cognitive process. When you look closely, it's not permanent. It's impermanent. So the cognitive error is seeing it as impermanent, thinking about it as impermanent, emotionally engaging with it as if it were permanent. The wisdom is you gain concentration, you gain a really sharp knife of analysis, you cut through the errors that you're making, and you come to see the object as impermanent. You come to emotionally relate to the object as impermanent. In the same way, there are ways of, let's say, cognizing or knowing the self that are mistakes. When you can cut through those, that's wisdom. If you don't cut through those, then even gaining concentration can make you more egotistical. Because now, look at me. I have incredible concentration. I'm like this really important guy now. Did you know I did a 14-day Vipassana retreat? Yeah, 21 days. Have you even done 21 days? Yeah, I did 10 days of yeah, we did 10 days of fasting. Did you oh, you didn't fast on your retreat? Oh, bro. Come on, bro. Do you even lift, bro? Did they make you sit still? You didn't even have to sit still. Come on, bro. So, even training in concentration without the wisdom aspect can increase your exaggerated sense of self. You see? Is that making sense? So this was a huge revelation to Western cognitive scientists who have been like pushing what they've been calling McMindfulness. I mean, it's good that people are training in mindfulness, but mindfulness just sort of blew up into this giant thing, and actually it was making people more egotistical, not less egotistical, and that was a big surprise. But to the Buddhists, it's not a big surprise at all. Okay. So Offer John was talking about the pineal gland. I'm not even sure if it's the pineal gland. I'm not 100%. I've done some of these practices. For years. I know people that are quite good at these practices from a couple different systems. I'm really not sure how they work, to be honest. I know they work. I know that they. I have enough experience to be confident, I would say, that they produce the results they promise to produce, at least in the sort of early stages. Like if you do certain things that you'll see light and all of this. But whether or not it has to do with the pineal gland or it has to do with the nervous system or, your your direct experience of those things won't tell you where they came from because they appear as like experiences of stuff. And once again, uh, if you don't have just like mindfulness practice, if you don't have a system in which that stuff fits, where you then use it as a tool to accomplish a particular spiritual end or type of transformation, then it's just even that can become yet another source of ego. Oh yeah, yeah. Oh, you did Kundalini meditation? Yeah, did you even feel the bliss, bro? Yeah, I felt the bliss. Yeah. Yeah, the teacher said I was like really, really good at the bliss. It's like, okay. Great. I mean, these sorts of experiences, like seeing light and having bliss in the body and feeling stuff move through the body, are considered to be. You've never cleric has that. You've never reached samadhi, bro. Have you even reached samadhi, bro? Can you even sit for like 2 days without moving, bro? Because I can. Yeah, and you don't have to look very hard to find people saying stuff like that. These practices don't reduce your ego unless you do the practices that come after them that reduce the ego. Yeah. Uh, so again, it's really important. I am actually a huge proponent of all of these weird things that you've heard of that come from the tantras and the Taoist stuff and all of these weird, interesting, cool things. I'm totally into it, but um, the trouble is, one, I think because they've become more popular in public, people sort of get them and don't know what they are and don't know how to use them, and oh, they can pardon my French, they can really f you up, man. I mean, they can because you're triggering. I mean, who knows exactly what's happening in your brain or whatever, but you're you're doing stuff to your brain and your nervous system that have profound effects. And if you don't know what they are and you don't know how to use them and you don't know where to fit them into your worldview and then use them to do some kind of work, spiritually transformative work, they can screw you up big time. So, yeah, you know. Okay. Where are we? 10 sets of renunciation. Yeah, get down. Get down, give me 10 sets. 10 sets of renunciation. Go. Do your 100,000 prostrations. Did you even do your non-dro, bro? Do you do full prostrations, bro? Or do you do half prostrations? Oh, you did 100,000 mantras, bro? I did like 400,000 mantras, bro. Come on, bro. Uh, right. So um, we've covered a lot of ground today. I think these are very important, very hold on. Haha. So I mean, I think these are very important points that we're covering. Actually, you know, there's a reason that ethics comes first when you're talking about training and meditation. And for those who did the retreat, or if you just want to go back and watch the retreat stuff, you can. Ethics use the same mental activity as training and meditation, so it supports your meditation training. Also, ethics are a tool to stop you from doing stupid shit so that your life is not absolutely chaotic. And then since your life is not chaotic, you're not as distracted, and you can train in meditation, right? Like, it's very logical. So you start with ethics so that your life isn't a mess and your mind's a little more calm, and you've already cultivated some of the basic cognitive skills you need to do meditation. Then you do meditation. Training in meditation. Yeah. So cleric asks, is this where precepts come in? This is exactly where precepts come in. And of course, precepts also have a karmic element that, for those who are watching who maybe aren't Buddhists, this won't be as interesting, but the vows, the 5 vows, pratimoksha, individual liberation vows, are aimed at creating another human rebirth in particular, or a type of heavenly rebirth where you can continue your practice. So you take refuge commitments so that you don't lose access to the Buddha, the Dharma, and the Sangha. And you take other ethical commitments so that, you're not killing so that you have a long life. You're not stealing so that you have all the material things you need. You're not committing sexual misconduct so that you have harmonious interactions with the other people in your life, including your teachers and your lovers, and so teachers, lovers, friends, and so forth. You're not lying because you need the truth, you need the Dharma, right? And you're not consuming intoxicants because if you consume intoxicants, you're pretty well guaranteed at some point to kill, steal, cheat, or lie. One of those 4. Also, with intoxicants, you're distorting your perception and your cognition, and you're making your mind less capable. And so the karmic result of this is that you have a mind that's more distorted and less capable in the future. And you don't want that if you want to continue your training. So that's the karmic picture. Okay. We'll just, for the Buddhists, there it is. And for everyone else, here, the practical benefits are that you're cultivating the same type of cognitive activities and skills you need to train in meditation. Why? Well, you need memory. You need memory, right? How do you train your memory to be active in the right way, to be able to hold the mind on the breath? Well, all day long. You have to remember, I'm not going to kill. And when a bug lands on you and you go, I remember I'm not supposed to kill this, right? And so you're training this faculty of memory in a particular way so that when you go to put the mind on the breath, that faculty is stronger. Okay? There's another faculty called introspection, where the mind is aware of itself. And so you go to kill the bug and you get to hear and you go, I wasn't supposed to kill. And then you notice, oh, wow, you know what? I have this vow not to kill, and I got like this close to killing, and then I realized I was not supposed to kill and I didn't kill. And so you start gaining this ability to be aware of your own mental activity and how well you're sort of carrying out the things you intended to do. Now, when you go to the breath, you need to remember to keep your mind on the breath, and you need to be aware of how well you're doing keeping the mind on the breath. So ethics helps you cultivate the type of cognitive skills you need to train in concentration. In addition to that, if you're not killing people, not stealing their stuff, not cheating on your partners, not lying to a bunch of people, your life won't be as chaotic, right? And therefore, you'll have less BS going on in your life when you try to sit down and meditate. It's not actually that mystical or weird or out there. And then if you believe what the Buddha has to say about it and other great saints, including modern saints, they'll tell you also, if you do this, you're cultivating the right kind of rebirth conditions to carry on with your training later. Pretty cool. Okay. So then finally, you need this third component, which is wisdom. Because as we learn from the McMindfulness movement, we learn from the mindfulness movement and the Vipassana movement with modern mindfulness that simply training in concentration and meditative analysis by itself doesn't actually fix your cognitive problems. It can help with all sorts of other stuff like pain and maybe some trauma that you have and all sorts of stuff. Really fantastic with all sorts of stuff. But it doesn't actually help you tackle your ego and arrogance. In fact, it can make you more egoic and more arrogant. So this is where the wisdom aspect comes in, where you analyze as we did an hour ago, all the components that make up your being, you look for that type of self that seems to be there, that in fact is not there. Uh, let's see. So, by the way, there are 7 people thereabouts watching at the moment. So, the purpose of this live stream is, if you have questions about Buddhism, if you have challenges you'd like to raise against Buddhism, if you have questions about meditation, questions about philosophy that are sort of tangential or related to Buddhist stuff, pop it in the chat. I'm just sort of going with wherever the chat is going. There's no particular theme other than sort of vaguely shepherded into this the pasture of Buddhism and meditation. Okay, so please, if you have comments, questions, whatever related to Buddhism, meditation, that sort of thing, pop it in the chat. So, Cleric asks, when we're talking about rebirth and continuing your practice, are we talking about becoming a bodhisattva? So, a bodhisattva, the translation, this term sattva can mean warrior, or it can just mean something that exists, like a being, right? And bodhi, as you should be aware, bodhi means to wake up, right? That's what bodhi means. So it is a being who's intent on awakening, or an awakening being, or a warrior headed towards awakening, right? You could also maybe say hero, an awakening hero, a hero headed towards awakening. So, yes, a huge part of training as a bodhisattva is this commitment that you take to, no matter how many lifetimes it requires, you're going to cultivate not just what's required to attain nirvana for your own benefit, but beyond nirvana, to cultivate all of these other properties that make you extremely beneficial to others. Is that making sense? So, for example, loving kindness is beneficial for attaining nirvana, but you don't have to do a whole bunch of loving kindness meditation to attain nirvana. You can do all of these practices that are directly related to you just attaining nirvana. But if you want to be a bodhisattva, you need to perfect the infinite quality of deeply desiring for others to have happiness, which is this universal sense that may all beings have happiness and the causes of happiness. And then you also have to perfect karuna, compassion, universal compassion, where you have the feeling, oh, may all beings be completely liberated from suffering and the causes of suffering. Yeah. You can develop some of that on your way to nirvana, but you don't have to bring it to perfection, because the causes of nirvana don't actually require you to bring that to perfection, in my understanding of the path to nirvana. In addition to that, on the bodhisattva path, there are 6 perfections. Yeah. And so you need to perfect ethics, patience, perseverance. Perseverance, effort, the ability to exert effort. What did I miss? Ethics, generosity, perseverance, effort, concentration, and wisdom. Yeah. And so, in order to perfect those, you go through a process of bringing together, though, again, this is very complicated. So, again, stop me anytime. Please ask another question at any time. But you're bringing to perfection certain qualities that, if you have them perfected, are massively beneficial to other beings. And you're combining that with an infinitely expanded sense that you want all beings to be happy and free from suffering. And if you'd like a sense of how incredibly profound that quality actually is, how incredibly powerful that quality actually is of love and compassion. Look at Paulden Gyatso, who I'll put a link in the chat. Paulden Gyatso. So Paulden Gyatso, for example, was imprisoned by the Chinese for a very, very, very long time and was tortured, if not daily, almost daily. And I mean, his suffering was just immense. And when the Dalai Lama asked him after Paulden Gyatso escaped from these horrific conditions in which he was being held, asked him, he said, "Well, were you afraid?" And Paulden Gyatso said, "I was, and what he meant was, were you afraid for your life?" And Paulden Gyatso said, "I was afraid I'd lose my compassion for the people that were torturing me." Yeah. And to put it in a little bit more scientific terms, as I said before, if you look up Mingyur Rinpoche, who I'll also put in the chat, Yongye Mingyur Rinpoche. If you look up Mingyur Rinpoche and his the cognitive tests that were done on Mingyur Rinpoche, the way that they measure loving kindness and compassion in Western cognitive psychology, or just in Western cognitive science rather, is they look at the empathy center of the brain, and when they asked him, "Can you generate compassion?" and in a fraction of a second, the area of his brain associated with empathy was so active that it didn't fit on the normal bell curve for human empathy, right? So as a bodhisattva, you have to cultivate deliberately through various types of training overwhelming, unbelievable, extremely powerful loving kindness and compassion to a degree that someone simply striving for nirvana doesn't have to do. Doesn't mean they don't develop those, but they don't have to develop them to the same degree. And the reason for this is along the path of a bodhisattva, eventually you attain nirvana. And you need to go back to desire, right? You need to have a desire that is powerful enough to stop you from falling into a personal nirvana when you die so that you can continue on and help other beings. And what desire is that? It's your loving kindness and compassion. Yeah. Yeah. This is this is actually pretty high level stuff. Okay, a lot of new questions coming in. I don't want people to hop off if I don't answer them quickly enough. So do hang in there. I'm doing them one by one. Hang in. I will get to you. So Gong Sho says, "Who seeks enlightenment when the seeker itself becomes the primary obstacle?" So this is kind of sort of Zen, Chan Buddhist kind of argument. One of my teachers, very long time Zen practitioner, very, very incredible, capable practitioner. And we spent a lot of time working on arguments and ideas like this one. Um, when you're talking about something like Chan or Zen practice, the method is a little bit different by the time you get to this level of the discussion. And there's a really lovely talk. Let's see if I can find it. There's a really lovely talk that I saw once. Yes. And this, I will pop it in the chat. You can watch it later. His description of Mahamudra, which is basically like Geluk this my main school is sort of like Geluk Zen, you could say. His description of Mahamudra is not very good, but his description of Zen is really good. And what he says there is, look, actually, what most people consider sort of Zen or Chan practice, as we see it sort of globally and in particular in the West, is actually an advanced form of practice that you would do after you had already done a huge amount of study, a huge amount of practice, a huge amount of recitation, a huge amount of purification practice, right? Like after you had already done that sort of long, arduous trek from being an initiate monk to being a senior monk, then you would do your Chan, sort of what we would consider normal Chan practice. And this is where questions like this, who seeks enlightenment when the seeker itself becomes the primary obstacle? Questions like this become very important. Because what that question is pointing to, for example, I find it really, really helpful to look at someone like the first Panchen Lama's text on Mahamudra to get at a more something a little more substantial to talk about in response to that question. So what he said is, okay, stay with me for a second. Stay with me for a second. And I said, I will get to everyone's questions in the chat, but stay with me, okay? Very important. We were talking about before, you're doing meditation, for example, on vision. And through doing meditation on vision, you come to see that there is the seer, which is the visual sense, the visual consciousness, and what is seen. And there's no you in between. There's just seeing. And you can go watch the retreat that I just put on a month ago. And I mean, there were people that did that retreat that have never done that amount of meditation before, and they were already having these experiences. So it's not actually that difficult to do. This is something that erupts in your experience if you do these practices. It's obvious to you that there's no self in between. So you do this with vision. You do it with tactile sensation. You do it with smell. You do it with taste. You do it with sound. And now all of a sudden, the 5 external senses, it's obvious to you from experience there's no self there, because there is simply the cognitive faculty that's knowing stuff and the stuff that is being known by that cognitive faculty, and there's no you in between. Right? It's obvious from your experience. So you do that practice. Okay? Then, when your external senses are less reactive because you've done all this work on them, then you turn the mind's attention inward. So this is more like a classic Mahamudra method that's it has a few more stages than just sort of the just sitting method that became popular in Japan. Then you turn the mind inward, you become aware of mental content. And in a short period of time, as we said, instead you stop seeing mental content as you, and it separates again, and it's obvious that there's mental consciousness and there's the stuff that mental consciousness is aware of. And then at some point, because of the concentration that's being generated on consciousness, the 5 external sense gates turn off, and you're just in a spaceless, timeless awareness of awareness itself. Okay? So, in that condition, the first Panchen Lama recommends, okay, now, in that condition, who seeks enlightenment when the seeker itself becomes the primary obstacle? The seeker seemed to be there. There seemed to be a meditator there doing all of this meditation for some reason. He said, like a little fish in a pond that's completely still. Like a little fish in a pond that's completely still. Swim with introspection in consciousness and look for that meditator. So in a state of, again, just to back up, in a state of awareness where the 5 external senses have turned off, your only awareness is of consciousness itself. And because of concentration, all of this mental chatter and blah, blah, blah has stopped. So there's just awareness of awareness, with the 5 external senses turned off, so there's no sense of time and space. In that or ordinary time and space. In that condition, like a little fish swimming through a completely still pond, move your introspection around and look for the meditator. Who's the one meditating? Because that one that you think is meditating, even in that extremely subtle state of concentration, is the primary obstacle. Or in the way that this question's framed in kind of a Chan or Zen sense, is the seeker itself, is the meditator itself. Look for that meditator himself or herself or itself. Look for the mind that is doing the meditating, and you won't be able to find it in the way you thought it was there. And when you don't find it in the way you thought it was there, hold with concentration. Hold that with concentration and fully absorb right? Fully absorb your awareness then on the absence of that kind of self within consciousness. And now you're meditating on selflessness. You're now meditating on emptiness. You're now meditating on the wisdom aspect of the path. Very powerful method, extremely powerful method. Okay. And once again, I didn't have to reference like blue Buddhas floating through the sky or, I didn't have to say, well, yeah, Buddha said this, so you should believe it. I mean, that maybe that helps to say that. Maybe it helps to say that some meditators, when they do this, recall past lives and all sorts of other stuff happens. Maybe that helps. Maybe it doesn't. Okay. Okay, so now 23. So, Gong Show, I will come back to you. I'll come back to you. But 23 says, how far can one go in practice while suspending judgment about karma and rebirth? Or do you just start to get it eventually? Okay. I had a long discussion with one of my teachers recently. A series of discussions. Where if you look at the Eightfold Path, for example, in Buddhism, one element of 8, okay? Do we have any mathematicians in the room? 1 out of 8 things you need to attain enlightenment is the right view, the right perspective on stuff, which is a totally conceptual at this level of experience kind of thing. In particular, in the beginning, you need to have the correct worldview, in other words. Now, it's one thing to just say that. It's another to ask in the way you have, sort of how far can I go without taking that on board? I think you can go a long way. But here's the fact of the matter. When you look at the great texts where they're talking about how to motivate yourself to go all the way, at some point, because of the amount of stuff you need to give up, temporarily at least, to attain the full attainments of this stuff, you just won't do it because it's too hard. Unless you've taken on board these other practices, basically the worldview. Because I'll give you one example. If you want to attain full-on samadhi, and you're not using tantric methods or like certain types of Taoist methods and things where you could do it in your normal life, if you're using basically like meditating on your breath or something, you need 3 to 6 months, sometimes a year of solitary retreat, unbroken, holding vows, no social media. Somewhere between 3 months and 12 months, probably, to just attain samadhi. So if you don't think there's another life after this one, are you willing to give up all of that time, all the stuff you could do, building your career, the relationship with your family, whatever, for that period of time just to attain some state you're not even sure exists? Probably not. For most people, the answer is probably no. So you can go a fair distance, but to complete the process, unless you're using some of these more advanced methods, probably you're not going to take it all the way unless you have the worldview. And speaking more colloquially, sort of off the cuff, I've never met anyone who didn't have the worldview who had the attainments. Yeah. I've met a lot of people that do meditation and have done mindfulness and blah, blah, blah. But even some of my own students, I had one of my students tell me that they had been meditating and doing stuff for 30 years. And then they met me and made more progress in 6 months. Because it's different if you're training with people that hold the views, even if you don't hold them yourself. It's not the same as training with people that don't hold the views. It's not the same as training if you hold the views. It just takes on more weight. And so I had a long conversation with one of my teachers about this, and he for years didn't hold all the views. And then he came to a certain point in his practice and he got stuck and he couldn't go any further. And he thinks, in his view, in his opinion rather, that it's because he wasn't holding all the views. That simply holding the views itself, it does something to help unlock the subtler levels of the practices. Whether or not that's true, I couldn't tell you. But here's what I have to say more generally on this, okay? I've argued for a long, 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 long time in Buddhism in particular, because Buddhism is actually shrinking. If you weren't aware, Buddhism is not growing. It's shrinking year over year, and over the next 20 years, it's going to get smaller. There'll be less Buddhists, less young Buddhists. There'll be a lot of people deconverting. And I think the reason for this is that, rightly so. If you don't have good arguments for your position for rebirth and karma, for example, why would I take up your religion? Why would I join? If you can't explain to me why these are good positions to hold, why would I do this? Unless I just have an, natural attraction to it. And then even if I had a natural attraction, let's say I do it for a few years, it's like it's okay. It works okay. I don't put a whole lot of effort into it. Maybe I put a lot of effort into it, but I'm new, so I don't make very much progress, whatever. And then I hear a really good argument against rebirth or karma. And then I put in less effort because, like, why am I going to put in all this effort if this isn't real? And then a few years later, I quit and I go back to doing whatever. Like, this is the process that people go through. So I could harp on about this for a long time. I have like a 150-page document talking about, in this time period, as we sit here right now, I think we have the best arguments for the idea that consciousness is not the brain that we have ever had in any period in human history. And I am prepared to defend that against the best philosophers and scientists that I can find. And I have a PhD, and I have defended it against some of these ideas at a pretty high level in a Western academic setting. So, again, I think there are very good arguments and very good reasons to think that consciousness, at least at the level that we're talking about, is not physical. Yes, obviously the surface of your mind is associated with your brain, but um, there's quite good evidence to think that consciousness is not physical and that rebirth is a real thing, and that if rebirth is a real thing, that at least the most critical aspects of karma that relate to your practice are also real things. So, for example, if you look at research from the University of Virginia, which I'll pop into the chat. So if you look at research into children with past life memories from the University of Virginia, they have thousands of case studies from all over the world, even from families where they don't hold religious views opposed to rebirth, of children that report memories from past lives, some of which can be verified. And even more importantly than that, and interestingly, than that. Some of those kids have habits from a previous life. In other words, they carry over phobias, they carry over dietary habits, they carry over emotional habits. And this is the sort of thing that's described in Buddhist texts when they talk about karma, that you carry over the some of the emotional habits and so forth from your previous rebirths. And that's the big thing that you're sort of fighting for in training your mind in this lifetime, is to plant habits that will be more beneficial in this life, of course, but also moving forward, that the seeds you've planted in terms of the potential for your mind to generate new states in the future are good ones. Yeah. Okay. uh yeah, and then same thing with karma. I think we have the best evidence now that we have ever had for something like a full-blown version of karma, because of the results we have achieved in special relativity and special status of consciousness positions in quantum mechanics. And yes, I know that there are, 14 or 20 different ways of interpreting quantum mechanical experiments, but part of my PhD work was assessing these and looking at the state of the field. And frankly, many worlds has not had great success in terms of working out their math, for example. Uh, and there's still one version of the Copenhagen interpretation that has not been ruled out by experimental stuff. And there have been numerous no-go experiments that have shown that a consciousness causes the collapse of the wave function interpretation still a viable possibility. And those experiments have ruled out a number of other possibilities. Now, if that's the case, if consciousness is part of what makes physical things into actual events, then we have a mechanism in reality to explain why stuff from consciousness would cause the world to exist in a certain way, i.e., karma, right? This is the basis of the bigger picture of karmic theory. So we have the best evidence now for rebirth and karma than we have ever had in human history, for what it's worth. I could go on all night about that, but I won't. Okay. Uh, let's see who's next. What do you think about Tendai, the Tendai school? I have a good friend. You're quite welcome, sir or ma'am. Okay. So, what do I think about Tendai? I have a good friend who's a very, very serious Tendai practitioner. And if you'd like to watch a really cool documentary, I think this is free at the moment. Oh, I think maybe you have to get it on Amazon. I'm not sure. But in any case, there's this wonderful documentary, The Marathon Monks of Mount Hiei. Mount Hiei is where the head temple for one of the major denominations of Tendai is. And yeah, I mean, it's a little bit weird to try to talk about tantric stuff, but um, frankly, it's because if first of all, it's subject to like huge misunderstandings, even amongst people who have studied it and train in it, and it's stuff that can really screw you up. Like they use techniques that can screw you up psychologically, and that's why they don't talk about them. like again, it's pretty common sense. Okay. Um, so what do I think about it? As far as I can tell, Tendai came from, if I'm not mistaken, not directly from India, but I think it came through China to Japan. And so, yeah, there were from a number of different monastic traditions in India. There were tantric traditions being taught as part of the larger monastic university system, having to do with the Middle Indian period in India, and those made their way to China and then Japan, and then of course they made their way to Tibet, where, at least as far as I know, they were preserved in a very, very full, robust form up to the modern day. And then of course the Tibetans have added tremendous tremendous understanding to those practices in their own in their own right. So, what do I think about it? Um, I think it's a valid form of practice. Well, yeah. Someone said China de facto founder is Xi. I think Xi, if I'm not mistaken, is like the de facto founder of virtually everything. Uh, so, but in Asia in general, and maybe China in particular, they have a habit of when a practice is seen as particularly important, even if it wasn't from a historically important figure, they will attribute it to that figure to lend more credibility and weight. Yeah, I know, it's funny, right? They'll add more credibility and weight to that thing. So, um, one small example that I think is really fantastic is the muscle and tendon changing classic. Okay. Muscle and tendon changing classic and the bone marrow washing classic, I believe it's called. Right. Someone in the chat will probably know if they're familiar with what's going on with Chinese stuff. So these are two really important texts in the Shaolin tradition, and they were supposedly brought to China by Damo, i.e., depends on who you ask, but this is supposedly one of the great Indian yogis, and he brought this understanding to the Shaolin temple because the monks there were doing a lot of seated practice and their bodies were wasting away, and so he gave them these techniques for stretching the tissues and so forth and making the structure of the body quite strong. And then part of that practice also cultivates these energies and so forth that I'm not going to talk about, even though I think they're real things, right? Um, but through the cultivation of those, you then make more rapid spiritual progress. Let's see. Oh, sorry. So the point was that there are now like 50,000 different versions of the Damo fist set, which on my Facebook page, Modern Buddhist Practice, I have at some point I have a whole thing on that. That was one of the first things that introduced me to a meditative state, and I only actually learned what these practices were and what they were for like 4 years ago from one of my teachers, which was a pretty cool plot arc. Okay, let's see. Okay, so Gong Show asks, isn't that more doing, and doing requires a doer, which is the obstacle? No, no, nope. So, uh, how do I put this? So, that question was in relation to this sort of Chan and Zen approach where you're doing just sitting, right? So, even in those settings, again, you have to zoom out. That's the practice being done by a person who has already done 2 decades or so of training in the perfection of wisdom literature, memorizing sutras and commentaries, debating those with their teachers and fellow monks, doing offering practices, doing prostrations, holding vows, like all of this doing stuff. And so their mind already has a very profound set of understandings and tools and predispositions that, in that condition of sort of resting in that state of awareness, will incline them to or give them access to the selflessness of their own mind. That's particularly the case when you do these kinds of practices and your mind just sort of naturally, we could say, sort of begins to swim around and becomes aware of the fact, oh, wow, actually, there's no self there. And then you go to your teacher and you say, I was doing just sitting and I noticed there was no self there. And he goes, that's it. Now just rest in that because that is the actual nature. So you're not doing anything. You're resting in the nature of how you already are, which doesn't include the type of doer you thought was there, which is the obstacle. Yeah. Cleric, if you tune in later, I'm not sure. Cleric says, I'm going to call it a night. How often will I do these? I don't know. I think I'm just going to pop on and do them from time to time and see how it goes. Okay. So Gongsho asks, isn't nirvana simply the ending of identification with and clinging to whatever arises and passes? And isn't Buddhism at its heart a practical path for realizing that release? It's an interesting question. Well, a couple of questions. To speak a little more personally, rather than giving you the academic answer, here's the problem I would say with putting it that way. If you do these, if you do practices, for example, that give you direct access to consciousness, you will notice that it doesn't appear in any way whatsoever to be arising and passing away from moment to moment. Except for the fact that when you're not looking closely at it, it is capable, of course, of taking on new objects and seeing new things and understanding new things. But from moment to moment, if you clear away all the stuff that's on top and you just look at awareness, it's always the same. It's simply non physical, timeless, simply uh, aware or knowing or cognizant. And every moment, even if you sit there for 45 minutes or an hour or 2 hours or 3 hours, doesn't matter. It's like that. And that's just how it is. And if you do practices that give you access to even subtler manifestations of awareness, it's like that with those as well. So when you start getting access to the fundamental nature of consciousness, it doesn't look like it's arising and passing away at all. And so simply abiding on that won't cure your fundamental ignorance. And your fundamental ignorance isn't the stuff around me isn't it's kind of permanent out there. That's not your fundamental ignorance. Your fundamental ignorance is that you have a self that isn't associated with the body and mind or is in some way unchanging and resting at the center of your being, let's say. So simply abiding in the conventional nature of consciousness won't fix the problem. And this is why, for example, if you look at the Buddhist canon when they're talking about the 8 jhanas, that simply attaining extremely, extremely subtle states of awareness, you know, and you dropped your awareness of your body 5 jhanas ago, okay, when you're doing formless jhanas where there's no sense of, I mean, beyond limitless space, there's no sense of space, and you're abiding in the nature of consciousness, and you don't appear to be in any particular location, and then you're breaking down even subtler elements of your being, and then according to the tantric yogis, even the subtlest formless concentration is pretty coarse compared to the 4 types of consciousness that appear when you're dying, and you can trigger those by doing certain types of practices, and the Taoists basically say the same thing. So these extremely subtle states of consciousness don't look like they're changing. And so simply resting in those won't fix ignorance. So this is a really, really, really critical point. And I think, humbly, this is the point that separates Buddhism from, for example, the Hindu traditions as a general principle. or at least the way that the Hindu traditions are envisioned by Buddhist literature. That may be the best way to say it. Okay. Because who knows, after 2,000 years of interacting with each other, what exchanges have taken place. But the way that these are envisioned, if, for example, we believe the Buddhist account that the Buddha went to the two greatest meditation teachers alive that he could find, and he learned the two subtlest forms of meditation, including one that we as Buddhists we call the peak of samsara, which Hindus would call, according to Buddhists, Hindus would call the union of Brahman and Atman, that your sense of personal self dissolves into the universal self. In that state of awareness, the Buddha said, actually, I haven't cured my ignorance. So even in the most absolutely subtle, stunning, profound, formless state of consciousness, from the point of view of the 8 jhanas, the Buddha said, no, my problems are not fixed. So, no, I don't think that's right. If simply not identifying with anything and allowing the mind to see whatever rises and ceases and passes and so forth, if that was the solution, then the Hindus would have already attained the stuff that the Buddha said it was unique to Buddhism. And there would have been no reason for the Buddha to carry on beyond his Hindu teachers and create something different. Does that make sense? And I think this is where the among a number of other points, I think this is where the Buddhist tantras depart from the tantras of other systems, because, at least again, according to the way that the Buddhists envision the tantras of other systems, they stop at simply resting on the subtlest types of consciousness that can be manifested into conscious awareness through meditative techniques. They manifest extremely subtle states of awareness. They hold the mind in those states of awareness, and according to them, right, again, this is the Buddhists talking about them, not them talking about themselves. But according to them, that's it. You manifest those things, you marinate in them for years. For example, if you look at, there's a really interesting documentary about Shiva Bala Yogi. Really fascinating documentary. If you can, I'll put the link in the chat. But if you look up a documentary about his life, there's some really interesting footage of him meditating as a young man and stuff. It's like really cool. But anyway, simply being able to rest the mind in a state of awareness where it's non-reactive and fully comfortable with whatever appears and arises and ceases and so forth in awareness, whether that's internally or externally, is not yet nirvana. And this should be a revelation, according to the Buddha, because in the highest rebirth realms and the subtlest states of meditation, your mind is already like that. It's already doing that. And if you've trained hard, you know that you can generate states like that with, like if you do some retreat for a couple of weeks, you can generate states like that for short periods of time. That's just like having a concentrated mind. It's not a particularly sophisticated or difficult thing to do. Okay. So I don't think so. I don't think so. I don't think nirvana is simply being able to do that. But if you've attained nirvana, I think you do that because your mind is in a constant state of concentration. So your mind will do that, but that's not nirvana. That's just like something that happens if you've attained nirvana. So this follow-up question, effortless resting in awareness, then effortless resting in the awareness, even prior to the knowing of experience with no mental overlay. Yes. So in the retreat I just put on, I think we were on day 4, okay, with people not by and large fully giving up their everyday activities. By day 4, most people in the group were being able to get at least a taste, at least a taste of being able to arrest in awareness without the uh, the sort of mental content going on there. And maybe their external senses didn't close completely, but they were able to rest in that awareness for some period of time and get a taste of what awareness is like without mental content and with less of the external senses appearing, like much less. So that's not a particularly difficult thing to do. You can do that in a few days if you use the right techniques, you know? I think that's something that you need to do in order to gain deeper realizations, but it's um by its and it, of course it'll make your mind way better than it is now. If you can do that reliably, it's really nice. And you'll be nicer as a person, and you can make a lot more progress on the path, but by itself that's not anywhere near the end of the path. Okay, and here's where part of the confusion comes from, because if you talk to certain schools of Zen, they'll say, "Oh, if you do that, you've had like a little taste of Buddhahood. You've had a little taste of instant enlightenment." And the argument that they're making there, if you read further in the sources that say stuff like that, they'll say, "Okay, now that you've had that little taste, you need to be able to stabilize it so that you can have that taste whenever you want. And then once you've stabilized it, then you need to spend like 20 or 30 years becoming accustomed to it." So again, it's like being instantly enlightened after 30 years of practice and then spending 30 more years continuing to be instantly enlightened over and over again. So, call it whatever you want, man. I don't know. It ends up sounding a lot more like everything else once you strip away the terminology and look at what they're actually doing. Okay. Not to deride them. I'm not deriding it. It's just, again, the way we use language is funny sometimes. Would the Buddha say "ouch" if he stubbed his toe? So there's a really interesting thing that happens, right? You know this from your own experience. When you go to the gym, for example, sometimes, let's say you're pressing the bar up, or you're doing a squat, or you're doing a pull up or something, and you get to that last pull up, and it really hurts. But your mind looks at the pain and it goes, "This is good," right? And it goes, "Man, this is good." It's not averse to the sensation, because the pain is just a sensation appearing in the tactile field of awareness. Yeah. And the more control you have over what your mind does, the less of your experience appears in the way that you normally experience pain right now. Again, this maybe sounds very strange to you, but it's not that strange. Like, if you were having an orgasm and you stubbed your toe, for example, the pain would be less. And we also know from cognitive psychology and their investigations into mindfulness, for example, that people who have both acute pain and chronic pain, in other words, they have pain that is sort of recent because of an injury, or they have pain that is because of something wrong with their skeleton or whatever that's ongoing for years, regardless of the source. If you train in just body scanning awareness, just doing body scans and being aware of your body, training in mindfulness, that all of the scores, the self-reporting scores for pain, go down. And I think they've also done cognitive tests looking at how your brain reacts to the pain, and your brain says there's less pain, which is totally bizarre. It's like you've made yourself even more aware of the body. There should be more pain if you have pain, and yet there's less. So would the Buddha say "ouch" if he stubbed his toe? um, when you look at the description of bodhisattvas' process of training the mind, when they get to what's called the eighth bodhisattva ground, I think it's on the eighth bodhisattva ground. You've trained in concentration, you've trained in the faculty of wisdom, you have like unbelievable meditative control, let's say, over your five senses and your mind and what they do. Your body is basically constantly filled with these feelings of unbelievable bliss all the time. To other people, you look basically normal, but to you, you're like swimming in constant feelings of unbelievable bliss. And they say that at that stage, they literally describe it in these terms. Okay, I'm not making this up. They say that if somebody were, for example, to start cutting pieces off of your body, and they said not in a short time, but over a long time, and not taking big pieces, but taking small pieces. They're cutting pieces off of your body a little bit at a time. They said it wouldn't even occur to you to start getting angry about it. Okay. So to bring it all the way back down to the level, um, on more than one occasion, I've heard my teachers say, for great meditators, current meditators, who have spent, 3 years, 7 years, 10 years, whatever, in retreat, training their minds in concentration and doing these tantric practices that give you control over your nervous system and all of this stuff. That they have, in fact, seen them in occasions where they bump their funny bone or they stub their toe or whatever. And they said they just burst out laughing. So the way that pain is experienced for a person whose mind and body are constantly filled with meditative concentrative bliss and these other things that they've developed, the way that the pain is experienced for them versus a normal person, even according to cognitive psychology, even when you look at anecdotal reports from meditators, etc., very different. To bring it all the way back down to the level, I'll give you one of my experiences, not particularly profound, mind you, but noteworthy from my own experience. I was in retreat once, and with one of my teachers, Venerable Thupten Chodron, and we were I think it was like day 2 of retreat, but I had been following her around for the better part of the summer, and had already done a number of retreats that summer, and when we were doing retreat on Lamrim, which is stages of the path. So you're going through all the different meditations and practices that are involved if you want to go from normal person all the way to enlightenment. Okay, that's Lamrim, stages of the path. And we got to the portion on impermanence. And I had already at that point, I think, studied impermanence for, I don't know, somewhere between 9 years and 12 years. I had spent a lot of time on it. I helped one of my teachers take a whole bunch of teachings that he had done on it and turn it into a book that got published. I mean, I had studied it in great detail. And she was giving this teaching on impermanence, and for some reason, it really hit me. I mean, it really hit me that I'm impermanent. And it hit me so deep and so powerfully that I think I was crying at one point. I can't remember, but the my whole body filled with blissful feelings. And my mind was focused on this fact that it really is impermanent. It's impermanent. It, it's constantly changing. And it was so stunning. And my mind filled with so much bliss and my body filled with so much bliss. I had no shoes on, and I left the meditation hall, and I was walking down a road with like gravel on it, and there was like pain on my feet, but it wasn't pain. And I don't know how to describe that to you, but like I knew that it shouldn't be comfortable, and yet it wasn't really pain, even though there was sensations there at the time that normally wouldn't be pleasant. And again, I don't quite know how to describe it to you. There were sensations there, but it wasn't pain in the normal sense of pain. And so when you're training in concentration and training in wisdom, something it changes in your nervous system so that the experiences you're having are not like they normally would be. um, so that's a kind of a long answer to a relatively simple question, but I'm trying to give you like some richness to the answer and not just be like, Well, no, he wouldn't say that, you know? In reality, we know cognitive science, the pain is less. From personal experience, I'm telling you, it's less, and it's different. And from the anecdotes of other people interacting with great meditators, they've seen them get injuries and stuff and just burst out laughing. And then in the classical text, it also says when you gain some of these higher levels, you could suffer unbelievably atrocious torture and other things, and it wouldn't bother you at all. And it's not because you don't know what's happening or you're too stupid or you're like drunk on bliss or something. It's just that your nervous system doesn't work like a normal person's anymore. It works in a different way. Yeah. So, yeah, again, it's actually a really good question. You know, it's a very, very good question to ask. Like, what happens to ordinary pain for people who do that kind of training? Okay. Well, we are on about 2.5 hours now. I don't think that I've missed anyone's questions. If I have, and you've been patiently waiting for 2.5 hours for me to answer your question, now is the time. Uh, okay, okay. Well, in that case, it is time for me to shamelessly plug something. Um, if you're finding this useful, enjoyable, etc., I don't have it set up yet, but I'm going to have a specific. Well, actually, go ahead and just use the one that's there, and as we go on, I'll change it. But if you'd like to support this effort, so that I can increasingly move towards doing this full time and be of more benefit to people, in the link in the bio for this channel, there's a link to the Patreon, and you can make contributions there. Um, and for the time being, all those contributions go towards either getting beautiful stuff like this so that I can actually talk to you and you can hear me and understand, or they go towards supporting charitable causes, both Buddhist and non Buddhist, as well as personal humanitarian efforts. If you'd like to get a little more information about the general stuff I'm doing and up to and so forth, you can follow this channel. Also, go to Modern Buddhist Practice on Facebook. Yeah. Okay. Well, don't forget to like and subscribe, guys. All right. I think I'm going to call it a night. If something occurs to you in the comments, just put your questions there, and on the next video, I can begin with those instead of sitting around like I don't know what the hell I'm doing, waiting for someone to join. Okay. Thank you so much for coming, and I hope to see you all again very, very soon.